BookTube, and welcome back to small town Vermont, where the book hauls just never end. You wouldn't think it would be true when it's mostly rolling fields and cows and native Vermonters, to the limited extent that those two things can be distinguished from each other, and yet there are books everywhere. I once again have an enormous book haul. In fact, this book haul is the size of the last two book hauls put together. So I thought the faster we get to them, the better. I've got a ton of mass market paperbacks, a ton of trade paperbacks, and a ton of hardcovers and one oversized hardcover. So we'll start off with romances. I didn't find any hardcover romances today. Vermont seems to be the place where I find hardcover romances, but it didn't happen today. Instead, I found two mass markets, one by an author that I don't know and one by an author that I do. The author I don't know is Jackie D'Alessandro, Love and the Single Heiress, which has a very alluring step back there. This will be what I call a modern Regency romance. It'll take place roughly in the Regency period. It'll deal with a woman of basically the lower caste landed gentry finding love with someone either immensely wealthy or, in this case, titled. But you can see right away from the step back that this is not a normal Regency romance, because the couple involved are actually in the act of coitus, which is never on the page or on the cover of a traditional Regency romance. And then this next one is older. This is The Magnificent Road by Iris Johansen. She was one of the authors that the romance fan who introduced me to romance actually suggested that I try as being really good. This has, I think this is the late 1980s, 1993. There is the Scottish laird in the background. He has the kilt, and he has the kilt is the wrong length. The leggings are all Roman, not Scottish. The sword is the wrong make, and he has a soloflex upper body, which you would never have had in the 14th century. But that's okay. Doesn't matter. I have read this before. I haven't read Love and the Single Heiress. Then we have two science fiction science fiction mass market paperbacks. And the first one, oh my, the associations I have with this first one go way back, way back. Let's find the original print date for this thing. It was reprinted 1 million times. This came out in 1976, the United States bicentennial. And it is Star Trek, The New Voyages, with a beautiful silkscreen original artwork cover done by a fan. Once word got out, the editors here are Sandra Mashuk and Myrna Culbreth, and they put out word that they were going to make an anthology of new Star Trek fiction. So not James Blish adapting the original show, not Alan Dean Foster adapting the cartoon, but new stories that had never been seen before, including never seen in fanzines. And this thing was what? This will tell me. It was $1.75, and I've mentioned this phenomenon before on this channel, every single mom and pop grocery store, every drugstore, certainly every bookstore that deigned to get this thing sold it out immediately, sold it out by the box, sold it out in every shipment. And you notice that, even if you're some, crusty 50-something grocery store owner who just looks at the spinner rack of books as a way to appease the eggheads in town, you're still going to notice if one of those titles is gone within an hour of you putting it out. And people did. And this is a terrific volume because the editors, somehow or other, I think I know the ways. I think that they had already made pretty good inroads with Gene Roddenberry himself. They got the original cast to put their names on introductions to each of the stories in this volume. One cast member per story. Now, you only have to read a couple of those introductions to realize some of the original cast members of the original Star Trek were extremely intelligent, cultured, and accomplished people, and some of them could barely sign their name on a royalty check. And yet, every introduction in this volume sounds not only really good, but very much like Sandra Mashuk and Myrna Culbreth. And that's all right. That's just fine. It was the names that did it, and oh my. I bought this as soon as it came out. I devoured it. Just devoured it. And, in any anthology, the stories are going to be uneven. This has, I think, a dozen stories and then a poem at the end. The poem, if I remember, is Omicron Ceti 3, I think is what it's titled. Yes, Omicron Ceti 3, by Shirley Meach, who's no poet. Those of you who know your original Star Trek will know that Omicron Ceti 3 is the setting for This Side of Paradise, where alien spores lower Mr. Spock's inhibitions. And he falls in love, and is playful, and friendly, and smiling, and laughing. until Jim Kirk realizes that it's passionate emotion. Of course, it's going to be Shatner that realizes that, but it's passionate emotion that frees you from the effects of the spores. So he realizes, he actually dictates to his captain's log that I need to enrage Mr. Spock. And his alien strength is enormous. Enraged, he could easily kill me, but it's a risk I have to run, and he does. He tells Spock that he needs him to beam up to the ship and then proceeds to insult him into a rage. And he has a steel bar as a weapon to help him against Mr. Spock. I remember getting this book originally, but I also remember originally watching that episode and thinking, well, okay, Jim Kirk is, he's a badass single combatant, and he has a steel rod. Surely this isn't going to last very long, because I had no idea. The idea that Dorothy Fontana had about how strong Vulcans were. And that scene is great. It is every bit as effective now as it was 50 years ago, because Kirk runs through the whole gamut of possible insults. And the one that starts to get under Mr. Spock's hide is when he says the Vulcan never lived that had an ounce of integrity, that they don't have any loyalty. We'd already seen at that point that Mr. Spock was willing to risk his entire career and his personal freedom out of loyalty to Captain Pike. And it works. And Spock knocks him around the transporter room. And the wonderful moment, which Star Trek lore says was insisted on by Dorothy Fontana, who I don't think is even credited in This Side of Paradise. She insisted that when the fight happened, let's not kid around here. When Kirk puts that metal bar up to protect himself, Spock is going to negligently bend it into a V. It's going to be easy to do. So this is not going to be a close fight. But anyway, that Omicron Ceti 3 is the setting of that poem, and Omicron Ceti, the episode, This Side of Paradise, is one of the saddest endings of any Star Trek episode. The crew has been saved, the day has been saved, the spores have been defeated, they're leaving the planet. Kirk is in his center seat. He's kind of asking for his end of episode summary. And you expect it to be, well, isn't it better that we have our free will back? All that sort of stuff, all those platitudes. And what Mr. Spock says is quite simply, for the first time in my life, I was happy. And that's how it ends. They cut to credits then. When I watched that original episode, I thought, okay, for the first time, I'm watching a network half hour of TV where I don't know how you want me to feel. That felt great in a way. But this has all sorts of uneven stories. There's one story in here called Nivar that gives us a look at Vulcan language and a little bit of Vulcan culture. There's a story in here called Visit to a Strange Planet Revisited, where a transporter accident causes William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and DeForest Kelley to transport to the actual world of Star Trek. So they're looking at these things wondering, well, okay, the special effects guys are supposed to be right over there. Instead, this looks like it's real. And that and a couple of other stories in here actually did generate from fan fiction. They weren't reprinted. These are all original, but that the reason it's called Visit to a Strange Planet Revisited is because Visit to a Strange Planet was the first time that transporter accident happens, and that was in a fanzine. Same thing, I think, with the story in here, Face on a Barroom Floor. I think that was an excerpt or an extrapolation from fan fiction. But one way or another, I am, as you know, building a couple of bookcases. I am filling them. I have a big bookcase and a little bookcase. I have a mass market of this buried somewhere back in Boston, but now I have this to go through. And now that I have it, I'm sure that I will reread a lot of the stories, if not all of them. And then the other science fiction mass market paperback was Red Prophet. This is volume 2 in the Tales of Alvin Maker. That little boy is Alvin Maker. And the big Shawnee chief there that he is holding on to is Tecumseh, who is unfortunately and very bitterly, it's a little thumbnail of all the inequities of American history. The Tecumseh is best known as the middle name of a general who went on to relocate, to use the euphemism, tens of thousands of Native Americans onto reservations of rock and soil and scorpions that could not support life. But Tecumseh was a leader on his own right, and remarkably persuasive. Even the most bitterly bigoted American politicians who heard him talk thought, okay, this is impressive. This is genuinely impressive. He, just listening to his oratory, unsettled the settled worldview of a lot of people. And he wanted to lead a coalition of Native American states in war against the United States. because the United States had made treaty after treaty with them and broken them all, sometimes before the ink was dry. And he had a brother, Tenskwatawa, who was widely renowned in his day, thanks to white military American propaganda as a drunk, as the stereotypical drunken Indian. He was widely renowned as that, and they both star in this book. They absolutely steal the book from Alvin Maker himself. It is an incredible dual portrait. And this paperback originally came with a step back, so that there was a little hole in the front cover, and then you got this full painting in the background. But I'll take this anyway. I don't have any of the others here. And then the last of the mass market paperbacks is a doozy. It is a huge doozy. We were out on the road today, driving around with the bean in my lap. Mark Richardson, who is my new roommate. He's not my host anymore. He's my new roommate. he's my roomie. And at one point we were driving along, he mentioned the kind of book chat that you're not getting, you're just not hearing it because it's happening al fresco in the car. He mentioned that at one point, for a stretch of time, American bestsellers were these gigantic atmospheric books, Shogun, The Far Pavilions, that sort of thing. And this was one of them, and for me, one of the most encouraging ones. This is And Ladies of the Club, Helen Hoover Santmeyer. You don't ordinarily see this in a sort of sky blue. It was ordinarily in a light pink mass market paperback. Came out as a doorstop hardcover, and it was a Book of the Month club and got some attention. Then the mass market paperback came out and sold boatloads, just boatloads. Was the cover art. This is a generational story of women at one particular club in one small town. They take their club duties very seriously. They weigh in. The narrative follows each one of them, and as the younger members come up and the older members retire and die, we just follow that whole thing. It's an inspired idea for a story. Really a demonstration of the fact that we need a wide variety of writers who will find magical stories in places where the last 10 writers might have looked at it and thought nothing of it at all. Instead, we got a great novel out of this. And the thing that stuck out for all those other doorstop books is that Helen Hoover Santmeyer wrote this when she was really old. She became a published best-selling author when she was well into her autumn years. That was fantastic. Believe it or not, a thing this size, there was a stretch of time where I did not have a customer come through the door who didn't want, they all got the title wrong. And even book critics and people writing up the phenomenon of this book often overlook the fact that the novel starts with an ellipsis, starts with 3 dots and a quotation mark. The title is actually and we're giving our thanks also to Ladies of the Club. So you have the ... and the quotes. But one way or another, a lot of people wanted to know about this thing, and it works. If you're willing to surrender to a gigantic novel, something that's going to take you all summer to read, it works. You'll really enjoy it. If you find it now, I'm pretty sure that And Ladies of the Club is out of print. But if you do find it, give it a try if you're in for a doorstop. This next one appears, then we'll do the trade paperbacks next, and this first trade paperback appears to have some sort of a history. It gives off the vibe of having a history. It's a Faber trade paperback. It probably never came out in this country. And when I saw it, I got that vibe, that FOMO vibe, that this has been talked about by critics and read by people, maybe enjoyed by a couple of generations of readers, and I know nothing about it, and I don't like there to be books like that. This is Tragedy at Law by Cyril Hare. I know nothing about this, and I bet a lot of you do. So feel free to sing out in the comments field. It appears to be some sort of legalistic murder thriller. And when did this come out? 1942. So the minute I held it in my hand, it gave me the feeling that here's a party you have never visited and that you should know about it. So if you've read Tragedy at Law, feel free to let me know. In Vermont, all the books are cheap, so there were no gambles here. Then the next one is a sailing memoir. This is Anthony Bailey. This is The Coast of Summer, where he travels all the way, does it say here, from Shelter Island to Cape Cod, just on a sailing vessel, or I think, if I remember correctly, a couple of them. I think this came out in the early 1990s, 1994, and did a fairly good job in the bookstores. I'm always up for a sailing memoir of any kind, and I don't think I've even read the whole of this. I think, if I remember correctly, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but I think I borrowed this from the bookstore where I was working. Most retail bookstores will let their employees borrow dust jacketed hardcovers. You leave the dust jacket with a note in the office. You take the naked, the other, the hardcover without the dust jacket, and you just have to keep it safe, because if you return it and it's in crappy condition, you have to buy it. But otherwise, you can borrow what you want. I think I borrowed this, and if I remember correctly, back in the early 90s, I think I borrowed this and just read the Cape Cod parts. Because Cape Cod and I go way back. If you were new to this channel, you won't know that. Cape Cod is, if you picture Massachusetts as a rectangle, there is then a fishhook that extends out into the Atlantic Ocean. That is Cape Cod, and I know it really well. So if it shows up on the title of a book, I think I borrowed this and just read that part. So I'll be reading a lot of stuff that I haven't encountered before. This next one is something we have encountered before. I've read it a few times, and I've also shown it to you on this channel. This is Carl Sandburg's biography of Abraham Lincoln. I found a one-volume trade paperback. It got my hackles up a little. All these things were dirt cheap, so I didn't pass up anything. Most of them were got at a place where my little Frida Bean is a celebrity. She is well known, and the shop is just a classic rambling thrift shop that just has anything you could think of, and that has a classic rambling shopkeep, a woman in charge who is as talkative as the day is long. If I am calling someone talkative, you know how talkative they are. And she's the perfect shopkeep, because she puts all her priorities in the right place. She cares about greeting people. She cares about being nice to people. She cares about, staggeringly, remembering people. She remembers not only my dog, but every transaction, it seems like. And maybe the compensation is that she's not all that good behind a register, or maybe not all that good at concentrating on each specific task that she's trying to do, so that she constantly has to say, oh, I'm sorry, I messed it up because I was busy talking. One way or another, you talk to her and you want to go back. So this was dirt cheap, and that's probably the only reason I would have got it, because these trade paperbacks, that HBJ is Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, back when Harcourt Brace Jovanovich was Harcourt Brace Jovanovich. And they don't make good trade paperbacks. This thing, I don't know if you'd be able to tell, but this is not going to survive a rigorous read. I got it because I don't have a copy here in the bookcase that I am building. And I also don't have the hardcover copy that I hauled on this channel maybe 2 years ago. Because the hardcover copy of this one-volume abridgment is just awkward. It's not a normal-sized hardcover. It's a little bit bigger and a little bit heavier. And I'm picky, and this was cheap, so I got it. And I'm going to want to read, whenever I get the Sandberg Lincoln, there's always chunks of it that I want to reread. It's not always his incredible account of the last days and assassination of Lincoln. That is the peak of the book, maybe fittingly enough. But it's not always that. It's other parts as well. Like, for instance, I think... it's been long delayed, but I think that a big new biography of the Douglas in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, that guy, Douglas, has been having an academic biography just percolating forever. It's supposed to be a huge thing. It's supposed to be really good. I don't think it's going to come out in 2021. It might be 2022. Maybe that flitted across my mind, and maybe I'll reread the Lincoln-Douglas parts of this. Then the next one is a trade paperback. It's a Norton Critical edition. Talked about those many times. Most recently because I've had the amazing news that my name is printed not only on the Norton Critical of the Tale of Genji, which I love, but also on the Norton Critical edition of the New Testament, which I was voxering this to one of you. I said, as much as I love Tale of Genji, I love the New Testament more. And the New Testament, the new Norton Critical edition of the New Testament and Apocrypha, has my name printed on the back for 1,000 students to see. The only reason I don't have it yet is because it's $40. And I've been going to the Brattle Bookshop in Boston for so long that I bridle at the idea of paying $40 for one paperback. No matter how much I know I'm going to love it, and no matter how many times I'm going to go back to it. The original Norton Critical of that New Testament and Apocrypha, I got it from Norton. It isn't the normal version of Norton Critical. It doesn't have any blurbs on it. But I go back to it all the time. So I know that $40 will be money well spent. But this Norton Critical cost me, I think, a couple of jars of preserves, something like that. And it's old, but you'd never know it. This thing is probably 50 years old. This edition is probably 50 years old. And yet, 1975. And yet you'd never know it because the thing is absolutely pristine. This is on Liberty. by John Stuart Mill, the Norton Critical Edition. So you get On Liberty up to here, and then you get boring essays about On Liberty. Can't have an exciting essay about a boring book, now can you? Mill was a freak, knew Latin and Greek by the time he was 7. And this book, I'm probably offending the ghost of the dead David Murphy, but this is a bit of a slog. Mill was not all that good a writer, except when he was writing book reviews. That's a rant for another day, probably tomorrow. But I haven't read this in forever and ever, and the only other edition of this, the edition I have at Hyde Cottage, is this exact edition, but not in this condition, not at all. So, I now have a copy there and a copy here. The next one, it's not the last of the trade paperbacks. We have plenty to go. Settle in. I should have told you that ahead of time. The next one is a UK trade paperback. I love UK trade paperbacks. I'll get a UK trade paperback of almost anything, but this is not almost anything. This is an author I really like, and it's a book I haven't read but once. I read it when it first came out in America. This is What Came Before He Shot Her by Elizabeth George in this Hodder and Stoughton trade paperback. That's battered. That's had a lifetime of its own. I read this only once. This is kind of sort of a sequel of the book that came before it. And that in which Elizabeth George takes a few liberties with the normal pattern of the murder mysteries that she writes. A few liberties with chronology and perspective. She's not that much of a risk-taking author. This is her most risk-taking book. Unless maybe the gigantic novel Believing the Lie, where she takes a few more risks with the standard acceptances of good and evil, who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. This also takes a few risks. I loved it. I love this author. I don't have any of her books in these big, satisfyingly chunky UK trade paperbacks. Now I do. Now I have one, and it's an interesting one. It's not. I hesitate to call this author cookie cutter because she's really good, but this is not like a lot of her other novels. Those of you who are Elizabeth George fans, I'm hoping you'd agree with that. Let me know if you do or don't. But this stands out. It doesn't read quite like a normal one of her books. Then this next trade paperback, something I have a hardcover copy of back at Hyde Cottage. But since I'm going to be here for quite some time, I thought I should. That sound you heard was the septic tank backing up. Don't worry about it. We'll have one of the children fix it. But this is a trade paperback, something that I have in hardcover back at Hyde Cottage. It's Case Closed by the insufferable Gerald Posner. And this is his big book about the Kennedy assassination, about the shooting in Dealey Plaza, in which he comes to the conclusion, same as Vincent Bugliosi does in Reclaiming History, only this is 400 pages long, and Reclaiming History is 1,400 pages long. He comes to the conclusion that the Warren Commission was right and Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone when he killed President Kennedy. And I know that's already getting some of your hackles up, and according to the latest polling information, it raises the hackles of over 50% of Americans who don't know anything about the subject. They just assume. And they're helped in that assumption by the fact that Oliver Stone's movie JFK was so popular that it forced the government to revisit the subject and maybe leave the door open for another gunman. I have read The Warren Commission, not the one volume abridgment, but all of the volumes. I have read the whole shelf worth of volumes, and I have also read, for my sins, every other book on this subject. And the one thing that history hates, absolutely hates, is luck. History hates luck. Just hates it. And the one thing that makes this possible, that makes Posner's case possible, is that Lee Harvey Oswald got lucky that day. Yes, his rating on the particular rifle that he was using was maybe not the highest in the world. Yes, the particular rifle that he was using was maybe not the best in the world. Yes, his vantage point was not the best in the world. Technically speaking, he could have got off a much cleaner shot at a window only 20 feet away, and he didn't do it. Yes, he would have been hurried in his first 2 shots. Would have had the rifle that he was using had to be manually recocked. It had to be manually reset. And that took time. And we know from acoustic records how much time there was between the shots in Dealey Plaza. And that is grist for the mill of every conspiracy theorist out there to say, add all these things up. And there's just no way. Unless he was lucky. He was all fired on adrenaline. He thought he was going to die that day. Maybe he got lucky. One way or another, no matter where you stand on the subject, this is one of the books to have on this subject, if for no other reason. I mean, Posner's really good. I call him insufferable because personally he is. In addition to all of the personality elements that make him insufferable, I also think he's had work done, if you know what I mean. And if you're a man, I know this is horribly sexist, but if you're any human being, and you have plastic surgery to make your face look better, or to fight off the ravages of age, not all your chickens have returned to the coop, in my opinion. I will never have work done, one way or another, whether he has or not, whether the rumors are true or not. His reconstruction of what happened in Dealey Plaza is really, really good. And his portrait of Lee Harvey Oswald is also really good. This is the best biographical portrait of Lee Harvey. It's not a biography of Oswald, but you don't need much to do a biography of Oswald. You need a couple of notebook pages. And this is the most sensitive, most feeling, most insightful. Posner interviewed everybody, went back to all the original documents. So no matter whether you think he's closed the case or not, this is still immensely worth reading. I found this trade paperback in perfect condition, so I grabbed it. This next one, we'll do some hardcovers here. This next one is spurred by a book we saw the other day. I got a book in the mail here at the house in Vermont. Kai Bird's new biography, or new study of President Carter's presidential years. The Outlier is what it's called. And when I get a book like that, I am automatically interested in the subject. I automatically want to either refresh my memory on the subject or learn about the subject. And that impulse is taken to an astronomical exponent if I know I'm going to write about the book. And I do. I am commissioned to review The Outlier by Kai Bird. And I know it's old-fashioned, but nevertheless, before I file a review of a book like that, I want to know about as much on that subject as is possible to know. I want to know almost as much or as much as the author himself knows before I feel right filing that review. Not only because I want to do justice by my readers, but also because it is an absolutely horrible feeling to file a review of something like that and have either the author or somebody really versed on the subject call you on it in a letter that gets printed. That is a horrible feeling. I know that it's a horrible feeling from reviewers that I have known. Because I take these precautions, it has never happened to me. And I'd like to keep it that way. So I found this book. This is by Hamilton Jordan. Ham Jordan was a power behind the throne for Jimmy Carter. The guy who got him elected, the guy who ran his White House. And this is Crisis, his book about the last year of the Carter presidency, which will be at least half of Kai Bird's book. How was I going to pass this up for, I think it was $1? How was I going to pass it up? I might have read this when it first came out. This was in the early 80s, 1982. There's Ham Jordan with very young President Carter. And who's that in the background? Is it going to tell me who that is in the background? No. I almost think I know. I think it's Bob Mossberger. But I could be wrong. And notice, disastrously, the picture on the wall in the Oval Office there is Andrew Jackson. Hoping no president does that again, since the only president in American history to incite a violent insurrection to overthrow the government had Andrew Jackson's portrait on the wall in the Oval Office. Carter did it because Jackson was a Southerner, but let's hope nobody else does it. But what timing is this? I'm going to absorb this in order to review The Outlier. The next one we'll go back to, we did Case Closed. We'll do another Kennedy book and another Kennedy conspiracy, but not JFK. This is Edward Kennedy. And you'll know already what I mean. There's one conspiracy theory feast associated with Edward Kennedy, and that is what happened at the bridge at Chappaquiddick. This is Leo D'Amour wrote, this thing sold like crazy in hardcover, and sold again like crazy when it came out in a mass market paperback. This is Senatorial Privilege, in which he lays out a case, not a tough case to make, that Edward Kennedy, young Senator Edward Kennedy, whose car went into the water off the bridge at Chappaquiddick, he escaped, and Mary Jo Kopechne, a campaign worker, a young woman who was in the car with him, did not escape. I mean, Edward Kennedy literally escaped. He slithered out of his driver's side door, reached the surface of the water. It's only like 4 feet deep, and at that point in the tide, and swam to shore, and knew perfectly well that the living Mary Jo Kopechne was still in that car. Now, he said later that he repeatedly dived to her passenger side door to try to force it open, and he couldn't. The tide was coming in. The water was black. He couldn't get a grip on anything. He was desperate, and maybe that made him careless. But then he went back to his hotel, and he didn't tell anything. He didn't tell anybody. He didn't raise the alarm. He walked past a police station to go back to his hotel. He could have pounded on the door. He didn't do that. And phone records, it was a pay phone. You'll have to Google that. If you're young, you won't know what that means. There was a pay phone. You could subpoena records from Ma Bell. You'll have to Google that as well. The payphone showed that all of his calls, almost, were to family lawyers. That is damning. Absolutely damning. And it's led to many a conspiracy theory about what really happened. I reviewed one of the most recent ones for the Martha's Vineyard Gazette. And I referenced this book when I did, because this was the book on the subject. Probably still is. The theory that was put forward by the author of the book that I reviewed is a little bit out there. So this is probably still the best conspiracy theory volume. Although, once again, as with Case Closed, when you're looking at the shooting in Dealey Plaza, luck ruins everything. It takes all the fun out of conspiracy theories, because if Oswald got lucky, that's the end of the story. And the same thing with Chappaquiddick. If Ed Kennedy just panicked, probably the way a lot of people would have, then that's the whole story. He panicked. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe the next morning he sobered up and had that horrifying moment in his hotel room where he thought, oh my God, what just happened? Maybe even in that moment he saw what would certainly have been a White House run just disappear like that. And that, of course, is why we've never had a second President Kennedy, because Jack Kennedy, his older brother, was shot to death, and Bobby Kennedy, his older brother, was shot to death, and Edward Kennedy, although he went on to 40 years in the Senate, helped a lot of people in the Senate, nevertheless he wanted to be president, and that Chappaquiddick killed it every time. So it'll be great to go over this again. I wonder, is this the book that has this incredibly damning photo? Just incredibly damning. I don't know if this book will actually have it, but a lot of the books on the subject do. Yes, this book has it. That investigator is sitting on the bumper of the car at Chappaquiddick, and Mary Jo Kopechne is inside that car at the moment when this photo was taken, but she's no longer alive. Some of you remember maybe a slim novel, a very effective novel, in which the novelist imagines that there was an air bubble, as there very well could have been, and that Mary Jo Kopechne lived for a little while before she drowned to death. The whole novel takes place in the middle of that moment. It's called Blackwater. Strongly recommend. But we don't have time for digressions. Now, do we? We still have books to go through. The next book is by an author you're going to know from a translation. You're not going to know this book more than the translation. This is Carolyn Alexander. This is The War That Killed Achilles. And she's known because she did a very commercially successful translation of the Iliad. This is a study of the Iliad. And it's very, very good. Every time I find it, I always wonder why I don't have a copy. I don't have a copy of this even back in Hyde Cottage. And I know why. It's because I give it away. People who read the Iliad for the first time or the 10th time and think, boy, oh boy, I want to read more about the Iliad. I don't just want to keep reading it my whole life. I want to read more about it as well. And that's this to a T. This is a fantastic study. Not only of the Iliad, but of war. Of war just in general and what it does. Very happy to find it. Again, these were all dirt cheap. The next one is a biography. I think it's one of two biographies that I got. Prince Albert. This is a little bit ratty shape. This is by Robert Rose James, and it is, as you can tell, it is a biography of Queen Victoria's Prince Consort, Albert, who was, when you can't tell it from this picture, but when he was 18, he was mind-bogglingly gorgeous, just incredibly gorgeous. Him and his brother, and they were princelings from one of these million little German principalities, where the British aristocracy, especially the very highest rungs of the aristocracy, would often go farming in the hinterlands, the hills and dales of these small German duchies to sort of reinvigorate the blood. Instead of marrying your second cousin, find one of these pretty German princelings and marry him. You'll have a brace load of heirs and no blood deficiencies. Victoria got one of those two, and the other as well. She got a brace load of heirs and a blood deficiency. But I don't know that she got that from Prince Albert. But Albert was told when he became Prince Consort, he was told, we know what this is. Here is your job. You are to accompany the Queen on state events and precious little else. Everything else here is taken care of. You don't have a say in the matter. And he resisted. He was smarter than he looked. And that was great because his looks deserted him, as they do with German princelings. The looks go at age 25. Almost on a dot. It almost happens on the birthday party. It turns out he had much more substance to him than that. And probably a lot of the substance that we attribute to Queen Victoria, she got from him. And then he famously died. You know, long before his time. He caught influenza of some kind, I think, and lived for a few sweaty, delirious days and then died, leaving her so grief-stricken that she basically abdicated her role as a public reigning monarch for decades. And this is, I've read this biography. Albert has had a few biographies. This is the most readable. And as far as I know, I don't have any of the biographies that I've read, even back at Hyde Cottage. So we'll start a little royals collection here at the house in Vermont. This next one is another UK production, but it's a hardcover, not a trade paperback, and it's got a great cover design. This is by Nicholas Rankin, and it's called Defending the Rock. It's Gibraltar during World War II. Look at that cover. Isn't that incredible? That's just amazing. I've never heard of this thing. Not sure that it ever had an American edition. And a big fat book on some aspect of World War II, I'll take it. Absolutely, I'll take it. Then we'll skip through these next three because I have a suspicion this video is going a little long. This next one is in beautiful condition, trade paperback, a book that I wasn't expecting to like. I was expecting to hate it, even though it's by an author I really like. I thought it would be boot kissing, but it didn't. It wasn't. It didn't end up being that way. I had my problems with it. There are boot kissing elements of it, but I thought it had more meat on its bones than I was expecting, especially since it's perilous for a biographer to write a biography of a subject that's still alive, especially someone who's been the most powerful person in the world. This is John Meacham's biography of George Herbert Walker Bush. The book is called Destiny and Power. I would not have given it that title, but I was amazed, especially in retrospect, especially the second and third readings, by the substance here. And I shouldn't have been, because John Meacham is a substantive thinker. He's a substantive writer. He chose to do this. And he wasn't the only one. There's H.W. Brands also did a biography of Bush. He did George W. Bush, who's not only still alive, but was in the prime of his life when Brands did it. And that book also was good. I don't know that I agree with some of our greatest historians writing history. You're supposed to have, perspective. It was Richard Nixon who said that historians should write only 50 years after the events they're covering. They should never write contemporary stuff. That's just not their job. I might agree with that, but one way or another, I enjoyed this. I enjoyed the Brands book on W, and I found this trade paperback. You wouldn't know that I found this in a thrift shop. You'd think I found this straight off the shelf at a Barnes & Noble. Then this next book is something you can sample yourself. Not the book, but YouTube is full of clips of this next book. I've resisted getting this every time I've seen it at the Brattle because I wanted it in hardcover. And I found it in hardcover today for one jam preserve jar, I think. This is Book Notes by Brian Lamb. And if you type in Brian Lamb and Book Notes to YouTube, you will see hundreds of long-form interviews that this guy did with every writer under the sun. And the bones of a lot of those interviews are in here, are in this book, along with some great photographs. One in particular that grabbed my attention. I'm hoping that I can go straight to it here. Yes, there we go. This is the biographer Joseph Ellis. Some of you will know this biographer. Some of you really like his work. He's not one of my favorites, but I think, for instance, Bill Rutenberg loves Joseph Ellis's books. And here he is studying John Adams' Marginalia at the Boston Public Library, up in their rare book section, which I have been many, many times. You can tell it by the subdued lighting. And also because in the background, someone is hovering. At the rare book section of the Boston Public Library, they're master hoverers. They're all about collegiate openness, but they care about their babies. So they're hovering while you look at them. But this is that. This is the bones of Book Notes. And if you watch the videos, the Brian Lamb videos on YouTube, even a handful of them, you will see the gambit that he takes. It's a conscious decision. Brian Lamb was a very smart and very well-read guy. And in his interviews with the authors that he talks to, he intentionally asks them questions to which he knows the answer. Very simple questions. At one point in an interview with Shelby Foote, he actually asked them, so what, modern library, what is that? And he knew perfectly well what it was. Every once in a while, you get an author who hears a question like that. The question is obviously just to get the author to talk. And every once in a while, you would hear an author would get a question like that, And they couldn't resist the urge to just snark. In fact, I think Shelby Foote was one of those. I think Shelby Foote said, "I'm amazed you haven't heard of it." Of course, your host has heard of it. Anyway, this is a big, wonderful, bookish volume, so fine by me. And then the last book here is a big, oversized thing of the best of Yankee magazine. All sorts of stuff in here. All sorts from, you get the layouts of what Yankee magazine used to look like, and the samples from regular columns, full-color photos, excerpts from all sorts of things. There's a story in here, if I remember correctly, by Stephen King. But also excerpts from great historians like the ones that we've been seeing here. So, I mean, this is going to be a delight to flip through. It's not, I don't think it's going to give me, there is a Yankee magazine anthology, not a big picture book like this, but a big, thick anthology of their greatest writings over, I think, 125 years. I want that anthology. I see it sometimes, but always beaten up. Because that Yankee magazine anthology, the big one, not this one, was a staple of beach houses, vacation houses. So the dust jacket was the first thing to go. And then the book got eaten into by salt water and humidity and whatnot. I've only ever seen it at the Brattle Bookshop in Boston in a battered shape that was not sufficient to get me to do it. But I will see it. And in the meantime, I didn't know this thing existed. But fantastic. That's fine by me. So there you go. I don't think I can do a Steve pyramid. I think I may have too many books. Let's give it a try. We have the best of Yankee magazine, a big illustrated version. There is another Yankee magazine anthology. Probably I'll come across it up here. Then we have book notes by Brian Lamb, which is just basically little bits and pieces of nonfiction about all of these authors. So you have Doris Kearns Goodwin talking about what it's like to write her book. You have Joseph Ellis talking about what it's like to write his book. You have Christopher Hitchens talking about how great it is to be Christopher Hitchens. And on, including heads of state. Mikhail Gorbachev, I think, is going to be in here. Then we have Destiny and Power, or whatever the flag-waving title is that John Meacham gave to this book. We spent too much time at Kennebunkport talking to Poppy, but still, it has its worth. Then we have Defending the Rock, Gibraltar during World War II. We have Prince Albert by Robert Rhodes James, biographer I really like. We have The War That Killed Achilles by Carolyn Alexander, who went on to translate the Iliad, and a translation I recommend. We have Senatorial Privilege by Joe D'Amore, about Chappaquiddick. We have Crisis, a find of the day, probably. Ham Jordan's book about being in the Carter White House when I'm going to write about the Carter White House. We have Case Closed by Gerald Posner, this neat trade paperback. We have What Came Before He Shot Her, Elizabeth George, in a UK trade paperback. We have On Liberty, an old Norton Critical Edition, John Stuart Mill. Oh no, this is going to go. Here, let's slide it off like there. We can make another pile almost that size. I've got so many. One volume of Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, The Coast of Summer, Sailing Memoir, Tragedy at Law. Feel free to sound off about this one. I don't know anything about it, but I have the feeling that some people do. And Ladies of the Club, Helen Hoover Stantmeyer, a beautiful condition, mass market paper. This thing hasn't been made in 30 years, and this is as beautiful as the day it came off the press. Happy to find it. Red Prophet by Orson Scott Card. Star Trek The New Voyages by Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth. And two romance novels. An Irish Johansen, The Magnificent Rogue, sort of what I'm called here at the house. And Love and the Single Heiress by Jackie DeSandro. I think I've read one book of hers, but maybe not even that. So I was right. The other pile, the second pile, is just as big as the first one. There you go. Sorry about the length. It was a big book haul, but it's a long holiday here. There will be no book haul tomorrow. There will be no book haul on Monday. So you can ration this out. That's my theory anyway. Thank you, BookTube.